So now that you've got a new flight controller, the first thing that you want to do before you install it in an airplane or even connect anything up to it is to install the flight control firmware that you want to have in it. I'm going to install INAV on here. And the reason for doing it now is there's a calibration step that you need to go through to calibrate the accelerometer that's very difficult to do if it's installed in an airframe. It's much easier to do it now. You get better results. So that's why I say to do it up front. I'm using a Maytech F405 wing. Yours may be different. But typically there is a button on here that you'll need to use to put it in the right mode for flashing the firmware. Depending on what flight controller you get, it may or may not come with some flight firmware installed. If you get a Speedy B flight controller, you might want to leave it alone because that comes with INAV pre-installed, and there's been some issues with people installing the later version of INAV. So you might want to hold off on that. But if you're using a different flight controller, you will want to install the firmware that you're going to use. If you want to check to see if there's anything currently on there, you can just plug it in and connect it to the INAV configurator and see. But if you don't have that installed yet, you can't even talk to it. So rather than looking at this just yet, let's look at what we need in order to get the firmware on there. And then once we have the tools installed, we can plug it in and talk to it and see what's up. So first thing you want to do is open your browser and search for INAV. And what you're looking for is the INAV Configurator. The INAV Configurator is the software that will run on your computer to enable you to talk to your flight controller and set it up. So there's two pieces. There's the configurator, and then there's the firmware that goes into the flight controller. So you don't want to click on this main link here. That'll take you to the firmware. What you want is the INAV Configurator. This will take you to the latest version. The latest version of the configurator is 7.0.1. And the versioning, if you want to look into that further, it's semantic versioning. It just means that there's a major version here. When the major version changes, it's because there's a breaking change that makes it no longer compatible with the previous version. So version 6 and version 7 are incompatible, for example. And then there's a minor change, like a new feature or something added, something updated. And then there's the patch version, which is a fix or bug fix. So the configurator is up to 7.0.1, and the firmware is a separate code base, so it's versioned separately, and the firmware is up on 7.0.0. We'll see that later. But it's important to keep in mind that you need to use the same configurator major version with the same major version of the firmware. So just keep that in mind. Not so important right up front here because we're not updating. We're just coming in new. As a new flight controller, you just want to install the latest stuff. So we'll look at just the latest stuff. So it becomes more important later on when you're upgrading to keep in mind what's happening with the version numbers. So once you get to this INAV configurator page, you can scroll down to where it says assets. And if for some reason that's collapsed, you can just click on that and it'll show you the links here. And you want to pick whichever one is appropriate for the operating system that you're using. I'm on Windows. I'm on Windows 7, which is an older operating system which may not be supported in later versions of INAV. And I'm tempted to download the 64-bit version, but I have some other 64-bit stuff that doesn't work, so I may download the 32-bit version here just to be safe. So I'm going to do that. So you can click on that. And this is downloading a zip file. So put this somewhere where you know where you'll find it. I have an external drive here, drive D, and I've created a folder called INAV where I'm going to put everything. So just so I know where to find everything that I'm going to download, I've created an INAV folder. I'll save it there. And once it's done downloading, looks like it's about 12.8 megabytes. I'm on a laptop over Wi-Fi, so it's kind of slow. But once that's done downloading, I can switch over to Actually, I can just click on it here and I should be able to. That's not what I wanted to do just yet. So I'm going to close this. What I want to do is, okay, now my downloads disappeared. So you click on the link to take it. All right. I'm trying to open it in the file system so I can show you where the file is. So I want to click on Show in Folder. So you can see that I've downloaded it into my INAV folder, and then you can double click on it to see what you've seen 3 times now. Your operating system may have the zip functionality built into it. If you're running a later version of Windows, like Windows 10 or Windows 11, it should automatically open the zip file just like you would open a file folder. And what you might want to do in that case is right click, and there should be an option to extract all the files. But my computer has this express zip file thing on here that opens up, and I have to do this manually. So I want to select extract now, make sure it's extracting to a known location. I've already got it set up to D:INAV, so I'm going to put it in the same folder here, and I'm just going to extract everything. And you can see this folder structure here is all the files that are contained in this zip file. The zip file is just a archive of a bunch of files compressed together, and this extracts them all into individual files so you can actually use it. So once that's all extracted, I'll close this window since I've already got this open here, and you can see now that there's an INAV Configurator folder. That is where the configurator is. So you can double click to go into that folder, and you can see all the files in here, and what you're looking for is this INAV Configurator.exe. So you just want to double click on that to launch it, and this will open the INAV Configurator. This will enable you to burn the firmware onto your flight controller and connect to the flight controller to configure it and whatnot. And you can see that the version number shows up here. It's version 7.0.1, which is good. That's what we downloaded. And up here it's got some weird port information which is not really valid just yet because we haven't plugged anything in. Now at this stage, I'm just going to see if I can talk to this. If for some reason we can't make a connection to the flight controller, there's a couple other steps that I will go through in a separate video. But if you look down here, there's some information about this STM USB VCP driver, or virtual COM port, which will enable you to connect to a flight controller over the USB port if this doesn't work. And then there's also this ZADIG driver for DFU flashing, which you might need if we can't get it into DFU mode. I don't know what DFU stands for, but that's the mode you need to be in order to flash your firmware. So I'm going to try to do that right now. I just have this USB cable. Depending on your flight controller, you might have a different USB connector. I think this is a USB micro or mini. It might be a USB-C, depending on what flight controller you have. But just make sure you have the right cable to connect to that. So I'm going to connect one end into my computer. And keep an eye up here. You'll see this change. But what you want to do is this DFU button here on the side. You want to press that and hold that in while you plug in the flight controller. Make sure the USB cable is around the right way. And you'll see a red light come on. It should just come on steady and stay on. In this case, it is installing a device driver because this is the first time that I've connected this particular flight controller to my computer. So once that's done, it'll say that it's successful, and the drop down up here should change to say DFU. If it does, we're golden. We can talk to it. So it looks like I'm in good shape. So now what you want to do is, well, first of all, now that we have a connection here, if you're curious, if your flight controller already has INAV installed on it, what you can do instead is disconnect. This should change back to this weird port thing, and then just plug it in without pressing the DFU button. Now it's going to flash. It looks like it's got something installed in here. And this port should change up here, but it looks like it's not. If that doesn't work, sometimes you have to restart the configurator and then wait a few seconds to see if this changes. Yep, now it came up to COM3. So now I know that there's something on there, so I could connect to it. Now, because it brought me up into this CLI, which is the command line interface, that means it's running a different version of INAV. So what I can do is just type version. I'm entering a command here, hit enter, and it tells me that INAV 2.0.1 is installed on here. That's a really old version. That's from October of 2018. So we don't want this on here. So let's disconnect. But it's interesting to know that there is something already installed on here. Like I said, your flight controller may come with INAV pre-installed on it. So now what I want to do is press this DFU button again, hold that in, plug it in, let go. And now this should change to DFU. And once that happens, now you can come down to the firmware flasher, because we want to select what firmware we want to put on here. Now, if you're not sure what board you need to select, you can look at the documentation. So I'm going to look here to choose a board. INAV supports a whole bunch of different flight controller boards. So what I'm looking for is the Maytech F405. Now there's a number of them that I can choose from. So I want to be sure that I choose the right one, because if I don't choose the right one, it's not going to work right. So now what I want to do is go to the browser again, and we'll look for a Maytech F405 wing, not the V2. I'll just search for that. There's a version 2 of this particular board, so I want to make sure that I'm getting the right one. Now, this is an old board. EOL means end of life, so I'm looking at a flight controller that has been discontinued. But the documentation here on the Maytech website should tell me which version of INAV I need to install on this. It should be pretty evident, but sometimes you might have to kind of search around. Let's look at specs and features. Okay, here we go. INAV flight target. We need the Maytech F405 SE option. So I'm glad I looked at this, because I probably would have selected the wrong one. So I want to go down to find Maytech again and select F405 SE, which is right here. Now that I've got the board selected, I can select what version of the firmware I want on there. And I want the latest version, which is 7.0.0. So just select that. I want to make sure full chip erase is selected. And because I'm online, I want to load the firmware. If for some reason you've obtained a firmware file from somewhere and you have it on your local file system, you can load it from here. But typically you'll just want to click on this load online link. And that'll bring up the release notes. This is important to read if you're upgrading to a different version, but we're just starting brand new, so you don't have to get too involved in the release notes and whatnot. So once this is up, you can just click on Flash Firmware, and that'll bring you down to the status bar. It's erasing what's on there, so it's getting rid of that old version of INAV. It's clearing the non-volatile flash memory. And once it's done doing that, it'll start copying the firmware on, which is a process we refer to as flashing. So now it's flashing the firmware. And once this progress bar gets to about halfway there, it'll run a verification. So basically it'll read back what it wrote to make sure it wrote everything correctly, to verify that the flashing was done successfully. So the flashing takes a while because it's slow to write to flash memory, but once it's in there, now it's verifying it reads. It's very quick to read. So now it says it's been successful. So now what you can do is unplug it. This is the first thing you should do after flashing your firmware, is just unplug it, let it sit for a few seconds, and then plug it back in and you should see some lights begin to flash here. And once it starts flashing a slow blue flash, or maybe it's a fast blue say that 5 times fast. Fast blue flash. Once it's flashing, this should change to COM something. In my case, it's COM 3. So now I can connect to it. And the first time I connect to it after installing the firmware, it'll bring up this screen here to select some default values. And this is a convenience. This will establish some default settings that you don't have to set up manually every time you create a new setup for the particular type of airframe that you're putting this in. Or it could even be a land vehicle or aquatic vehicle. But I'm going to be putting this probably in another Dart XL, which is a wing without a tail. So I'm going to select that option. And that'll set up, it'll load some defaults and save it to the flash memory or the EEPROM, not sure where it goes. There's a couple of different types of non-volatile memory inside the board. But once that's done, it'll restart the controller. It says it's rebooting, and it should auto reconnect. So now I'm presented with this screen, which shows a representation of an aircraft. And if I move this flight controller around, you can see that that responds in 3 dimensions. So we have a good connection, the accelerometer is working, so we can now start our calibration process that I mentioned. That is much easier to do at this stage than it would be if we were to install this in an airplane first. So now that we've got a good connection, I'm going to go to this calibration step. And this will be the last part of this video. Future videos, I will go into these other options here that we need to set up to configure your aircraft for its first flight. But the first thing we want to do right now is just calibrate the accelerometer. So what you want to do is select this tab and then click on Calibrate Accelerometer, and it'll give you this screen here, giving you instructions, sort of, on how to do this. It's not real clear what you need to do, but what you need to do is just follow these steps, 1 through 6, in the orientation that is depicted in these images here. It's not real clear what step you're on. And I don't know if you really have to do them in order. I haven't actually tried doing them out of order. But now, once you get it into a particular orientation, in this case, this first step is upright, flat, and level. Just click on this Calibrate Accelerometer button again. And this time it will check off this first step to indicate that it has been calibrated in this orientation. Now, step 2 needs to be upside down, but I can't really do it on this flat table here, so I'm going to take it to the edge of my table so this cable can dangle off the edge. You can't really see it. So try to get it as flat as possible, and I'll click on Calibrate again. Now it shows that step 2 is complete. Now you'll notice on the flight controller there's this little arrow. That indicates the direction that is normally toward the nose of the aircraft. If you orient the flight controller inside your airplane with this arrow pointed toward the nose, then you're all set up and ready to go. You can mount it in any orientation, but you'll need to do a configuration step later on to tell how many degrees in which axis, in which direction that it's offset to get the forward direction aligned internally. But for right now, we just need to reference this arrow here to complete the calibration steps. And the step 3 here says we want this on its side with the arrow pointing to the right. So once you've got that set up, hold it steady, click Calibrate Accelerometer, and now we've done step 3. Step 4 needs to be facing straight up. And we just continue through these steps just like this. Step 5 and step 6. Now you can imagine that this would be hard to do when this thing is inside your aircraft. Because how do you know when your aircraft is level when it's upside down and sideways? So I've completed the calibration steps. You'll see down here there's some numbers in these fields here. What they mean, I don't really know. They're probably just offsets. Nothing's perfect. So when the IMU, or the inertial measurement unit, which consists of the accelerometer and the gyro, when that's installed in the board, I don't know if it's a separate chip or if it's part of the micro. I don't think it's part of the microcontroller. It's a separate chip on there. Things aren't always perfect. So this calibration makes sure that we know, or that the flight controller knows, the offsets in all these axes of how that accelerometer is oriented on the board itself. So these are the correction offsets to compensate for any errors in the placement of the accelerometer on the board. That's my assumption of what it's doing. So what you want to do now is click Save and Reboot. And that will wrap up this video. I will go into further calibration or further configuration options here in a future video, probably after doing the hardware hookups and getting it installed into an aircraft. But that's it for this video, and hopefully this was informative and useful. Please let me know in the comments if you have any further questions that I can address that I perhaps overlooked or missed or was unclear about. My objective here is to get you up and running as quickly as possible, to save you a lot of time searching around on the YouTubes and the web like I did for 3 years before I actually got an airplane in the air. So be looking forward to future videos for when I get more in depth into how you need to set things up for your airplane to actually fly. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to disconnect.